There's a darkness rising in our land. A new breed of orc is on the prowl.
Today I am sitting here with a black eye and a concussion after being violently hit in the face with a metal pole.
Antifa, and that is the voice of independent journalist Katie Davis Court just at the White House this week, discussing how she was assaulted, the latest victim of Antifa. What is Antifa anyway?
Historian Mark Bray says
it's a radical left politics of opposition to the far right that doesn't rely on the police or the courts or the state to stop the fascist threat.
When black lives are under attack, what do we do? Stand up, fight back!
Sometimes I compare it to feminism, right? There are feminist groups, but feminism itself is not a group. There are Antifa groups, but Antifa itself is not a group.
Are we really sure about that? For a group that's not a group, Antifa has seemed to be able to get away with doing a lot of damage, especially in places like Portland, Oregon, and has been getting away with it for years. Antifa has been around basically every riot and every instance of civil disorder in recent years. Of course, the George Floyd race riots are one prominent example. And then on September 10th, the murder that everyone saw, a gunman opened fire on Charlie Kirk, assassinating him at Utah Valley University. Among the messages inscribed, etched on bullets found in the shooter's alleged weapon, was one message reading, quote, "Hey fascist, catch," as in like, catch this bullet. Now that the shooting really has started, a lot more people are paying attention to Antifa. And while members of Antifa do indeed have a lot in common with the orcs of Lord of the Rings, from the physiognomy that evokes a potato mixed with a venereal disease, these orcs are also gay and retarded. But as we saw on September 10th, they also have weapons. It is true that this group is decentralized. That is true. It is true that it appears as if trying to tackle a group like Antifa, bring them down, is like fighting a hydra. Fortunately, there's a quick and easy way of doing away with them.
Unfortunately not. The Antifa of today was born out of the new left terrorists of the 1970s.
Kyle Scheidler is the director for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism at the Center for Security Policy.
We're a non-profit, nonpartisan national security think tank. We've been around since about 1988. And I'm responsible primarily for all of our counterterrorism educational efforts, which includes the training of law enforcement and working with, as well, state legislators on issues where they can beef up their laws related to some of these threats that we've seen in recent years. As part of that work in 2020, I was the editor of Unmasking Antifa, 5 Perspectives on a Growing Threat, where I also testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on the Constitution regarding the threat Antifa poses to the U.S. Constitution.
So you are well aware of Antifa and different extremist leftist networks, and you have detailed just how to take them down, or at least a proposal for how to do so in your piece titled "How to Dismantle Far Left Extremist Networks at the American Mind." Now, what I appreciate about this piece, to begin with, is that you don't just go down to Main Street, find the local Antifa store, and you can't just nail up a condemned sign on there. Yeah, I mean, how do you actually, how do you define something that is by design undefinable? It's kind of like a hydra. And then furthermore, in our current government, in our current system as well, what are the actual mechanisms that you can use, that you can actually enforce to take down left-wing extremist networks like Antifa? You address that to begin your piece. Just what are some of the statutes that could be used by our federal government and the current administration to not only define, but to have some legal pretext for going after these groups?
Sure. Well, I think your first comment raises one of the biggest challenges that we have, which is education and getting people to understand that just because a network is decentralized and non-hierarchical does not mean that it is not an organization for purposes of criminal or other statutes, and does not mean that they do not exist. This is the game that we saw certain politicians playing in 2020, where they would say, well, there is no such thing. It doesn't exist. They don't have leaders. And this is, of course, false. It's deliberately misleading. They are a decentralized network, but they have structures. They write endlessly about how they organize those structures, how they create those structures through a variety of methods. And this is all knowable if one takes the time to actually do the study. The problem that we have right now is that our federal law enforcement officers have not done that background work, in part because it's certainly over the last 20 years of the Biden administration, and before that, the Obama administration, there was no encouragement for them to do that. Fortunately, we are now seeing the Trump administration start to turn that around. They're starting to talk about Antifa and the threat that it represents, and they're directing federal law enforcement and other agencies to begin to take this seriously, which is to the good. But it does mean that they are operating at a deficit, and they need to get smart quick. Part of getting a bureaucracy to operate is to get it to use the correct terminology. Any bureaucracy, whether it's federal law enforcement or what have you, they operate on the basis sort of categories, right? And if they don't have a category for a thing, it doesn't exist or it's hard to define. And so one of the points I make in the piece is encouraging the Trump administration to direct our national security, federal law enforcement agencies to say, you will address the threat of far left extremism. It is a real thing. It is definable. It consists of certain specific ideologies that behave in certain ways. These things are knowable. They are studyable, and you can take action against them. And getting them to understand that, getting them to create that category of thought, so that they can begin to take action against specific organizations and networks, really for me was the primary thing that I wanted to convey. Because otherwise, the challenge you run into is for the last decade, really 2 decades, federal law enforcement has functioned on this concept of violent extremists. They're sort of viewed as all being disconnected wackos who don't really have a structure, don't really have a purpose. They're just kind of crazy people that do evil things. And getting them to understand that, no, actually, Antifa is a very specific type of thing. They organize in a specific type of way. They commit specific types of crimes, and they can be targeted as a result. And that's really job number one.
I think for any reasonable person listening, reasonable according to my definition, I don't know what that is anymore, but any reasonable, fair person listening, they understand the task before the Trump administration right now. They understand the task before the Department of Justice right now. And I think there's an understanding that it's not just quick and easy fixes here when it comes to dismantling these terrorist organizations. But I think so often with any sort of policy proposal, you look at any category. I think what befalls so many people who, not only the pundit class, but in Congress as well, there are effective policy proposals that are probably not achievable, or there are achievable policy proposals that probably aren't very effective. I think what you have written about with a whole of government approach to taking down these leftist extremist networks, I think it's actually both achievable and effective. And we're going to get into that coming up next. Kyle Scheidler is my guest this morning. He's the Director for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism for the Center for Security Policy. We're talking about how you actually go about taking down Antifa. When it comes to taking down these leftist networks, I think the moral, obviously, and you feel free to disagree with this if you want to, but the moral is really simple. If you are in this country, or if you're coming from another country and come into this country and you attempt to deprive other citizens of their right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, their God-given rights, you don't get to do that. That's against the law. So I think the moral is pretty simple. I think the political will is pretty straightforward. That's not just a given, but I think this is all kind of based on whether or not the Trump administration has the political will to go through with a policy proposal like yours, or just a proposal nonetheless just like yours. I think that's the crucial part of this, is having the political will to carry this out. And so talk about what you wrote in terms of a whole of government approach to taking on these far left extremist networks. So if we've already changed the bureaucracy, we've already illuminated the fact that, yes, left-wing extremism exists, we need to go after it. How do we do that? And you write about that.
Sure. Well, I wanted to stress in that piece that obviously the Department of Justice, federal law enforcement has the lead role. We've seen them take that role with the president designating the National Joint Terrorism Task Force to take the lead against Antifa, and that's correct. But I wanted to stress that that is necessary but not sufficient, because the threat that we are facing extends beyond just the black-clad anarchists that represent Antifa and throw Molotov cocktails and attack police officers and, conduct bombings and the like. Those people exist. They are dangerous. They need to be targeted by law enforcement very effectively, and that is good to do. But there's a lot more going on here. There's much more extensive elements. You have the larger structures that funnel money, that support protests, that provide legal and other types of material support to individuals engaged in these terrorist acts. You have the organizations and structures where these people have day jobs. Right. Antifa is not a full-time job, right? So they have day jobs where they are essentially given tenure or sinecures where they can sit around and plot actions all day in things like labor union locals and the like. So what I wanted to look at was some of the places where you could start to put pressure on these structures. So one of the things I look at is, for example, with the Department of the Treasury and the IRS, looking at the flow of money through what are called fiscal sponsorships. And this is where a 501c3 nonprofit organization will act as a sponsor for a variety of projects, as they're called, which do not have a tax ID number. They are not technically an organization as far as the IRS is concerned. And what happens is large money will flow down from various sources, but particularly from large progressive foundations. It will go to these fiscal sponsors, who will then distribute the money out to a variety of community organizations and bail funds and the like, which some of that money will then potentially be redirected towards Antifa and conducting of criminal acts in support of various protests. So to me, that fiscal sponsorship is sort of the middleman or the central node around which the money flows. And if you can address that problem, you can make a big indent in the activity that we're seeing. Technically, there is no statute that authorizes this fiscal sponsorship arrangement. It's simply an arrangement that the IRS recognizes because they understood, like, okay, if you're trying to start a nonprofit, you have to collect money in order to pay all your startup costs, but you can't collect money if you don't have a tax ID. So how do we do that? And the idea was, well, another 501c3 could temporarily represent you while you get started, which is reasonable. The problem is it's being exploited in this way, where these groups will never actually ever file for a tax ID. They'll just change their name and fiscal sponsor if they start getting too much attention. So addressing that is one of the major points in the document. I mentioned individuals, residing in labor unions and the like as sort of full-time sinecures so that they can engage in this sort of behavior. There's actually a statute where you are not allowed to be a union representative or a union employee or even a consultant for a union and have engaged in a variety of certain crimes, both felony and misdemeanor. It's not enforced all that much, and we may need to go in and change those statutes to make sure that it specifically addresses the kinds of crimes that we see groups like Antifa commit. But I think you could use that to go after some of these people who hide within the labor movement and use that as their day job, while at night they're acting as protest consultants and professional direct action organizers. So that's another spot where I recommend taking action. Then you have the issue of education. And unfortunately, a lot of your bad actors in this space reside in higher education and in public education. I mean, the number of people we see arrested at riots who are, full-time public school teachers or school aides or professors is disturbing. And I pointed, there was a friend of mine who works at a group called Defending Ed Education, recently published a report talking about professors who are holding classes that literally are just organizing Antifa cells. Essentially, that's the whole point of the college class for which you get credit. And so we have this problem in higher education. And I say, why don't we go into the Department of Education and say that, like, not only are we going to target federal funding for any kind of college or university that is supporting this kind of stuff, we're also going to mandate that you get proper civics education that takes on the ideology of the far left and says, actually, no, like, this is a good country. We have a good constitution. This is the way our constitution works. These are the rights that we have. This is why we have them, etc. We've seen that take place in a couple of states. Florida recently passed a law where public schools have to educate on the dangers of communism and why it is different from our American system. So there are a couple of states that are doing this, but you could get the education department to make a push to see this take place in all 50 states. And I think it would be a way to undercut some of the ideological damage that these groups have done over the years.
So what you're telling me, this is a quick and easy fix, right?
Unfortunately not. The Antifa of today was born out of the new left terrorists of the 1970s. Terrorists that, after they were done with their, armed robberies and
they spent
and
life
bombings.
in prison, right? Life in prison, and they didn't get a tenure at universities, correct?
No, that's exactly right. They got tenure at universities. They are high-ranking officials in nonprofit organizations, et cetera. So, the damage that has been done over the past decades of inculcating this ideology is not going to be easily reversed. This is not a one-and-done thing that we can do simply. We have to take, as you said, that whole of government approach to addressing this subversion of the American system. Such that we see the support for this dangerous revolutionary ideology.
Well, I appreciate what you wrote at the American Mind, because prior to having read that, if you would have asked me, hey, how do we actually get rid of groups like Antifa? I would have said, just terraform the education system in this country. I wouldn't have known, though, I don't even know how that looks. I wouldn't have had any of these other ideas as well, because it's a huge task, as you just described there in great detail. And so, but there are ways to do it, and that's what I appreciate, because it's kind of like, I think it's D.L. Moody's old line, I like my way of doing things better than your way of not doing things, and that's what I appreciate about what you wrote. So I'm going to put you on the spot real quick here. Let's just pretend the Trump administration, Department of Justice, they take this piece to heart and they start to implement it. In 2 years, what does success look like? And I don't think we're going to dismantle everything in 2 years, but what should we be looking for as far as, hey, are we actually making some progress here about dismantling these networks?
Sure. I would say proactive, maybe even preemptive, intelligence-driven arrests of Antifa and similar revolutionary cells, not just picking people up after they riot, but stopping them ahead of time, getting convictions on conspiracy, building cases that reflect the reality of Antifa as a terrorist organization, taking movement against, taking action against individuals that are facilitating the fundraising network, that are playing the role of trainer and consultant in support of these kinds of riots and protests, and targeting the what I think of as the middle layer or the central nodes of activity.
Kyle Scheidler, as the director for senior analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism at the Center for Security Policy. Kyle, thank you so much for the time, and thank you for the great ideas in your piece at The American Mind, how to dismantle far-left extremist networks. I was smarter after reading that. And I think our audience is smarter after hearing you speak this morning.
Well, thank you, sir.
Now, you heard Kyle mention this in passing. We had some issues with our Zoom connection towards the end of the call. One of the things that you need to be looking for, he mentioned to me, as to whether or not we're actually having some success in taking down these far-left extremist networks, is not necessarily stopping the flow of money. Not necessarily stopping the flow of money into these organizations, because they basically have infinite access to money. It's whether or not their leadership, their trainers, their trained communist organizers, they get arrested. So that's kind of going to be this program's rubric going forward. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. Hope you enjoyed that conversation. And I'll talk to you again on Monday.